Hey everyone, good morning. Thanks for joining. Today I'm speaking with Ian Rowe. Ian is a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's also a senior visiting fellow at the Whitson Center. He also writes for the 1776 Unites campaign, and he's starting a new, I don't want to say schools or a school. It's called Vertex Partnership Academy. Is that like one school? Is that many schools or?
It will become a network, but the first campus, so it's going to become a network of character-based international baccalaureate public charter high schools, with the first one launching in the South Bronx next year, 2022.
All right, awesome. Thanks. Well, thank you very much for coming on. And
Yeah, thanks for having me.
so, I mean, I reached out to you because I read an article you'd done. I think it was in USA Today. It was about anti-racism in education and the bigotry of low expectations.
Yes, a hard bigotry of low expectations.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I don't see what's soft about it. So I'd like to speak to you about that, if you don't mind to start with. But I'd like to get into you with. I saw an interview you did, or I think it was a panel you were on about history and education, like teaching history in classes and stuff like that. So if we can speak on about education a bit as well.
Well, especially because that event occurred on January 6th.
Yeah, I know. It was because I was watching it after the fact, and it was like, oh, geez, it's on the exact same day. I shouldn't laugh, I guess, but anyways, yeah. So if you wouldn't mind, like, talking a bit about that article, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me on. Always a pleasure. I've listened to a couple of your podcasts, and you're on a great journey yourself, it sounds like, and that you had an experience. You left the United States, you came back, and there's a very different mindset in the country, and so it's good for people to recognize how things have changed so dramatically. And it is, I think, really important to kind of dig, what's underlying, what's underneath that. So thank you for the opportunity to chat. So I can speak about the USA Today piece. For the last decade, I've run a network of public charter schools, elementary and middle schools in the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan, almost exclusively low-income kids, Black and brown kids, Black and Hispanic kids, whose parents, entered the lottery for our schools. We had thousands of kids on the wait list, unfortunately, because parents are desperate for good education for their kids. And even though a number of our parents may have faced racial discrimination in their own lives or other challenges, they know they want to ensure that their kids have a shot at the American dream. And so, and a part of that is ensuring that the schools that they're sending their kids to have really high expectations for their kids. They're not going to tell them that they can't succeed, or that by virtue of their identity or one aspect of their identity, they're hobbled, or that they can't do something. And late last year, this came to be that the San Diego school system discovered, when they looked at their grading system, that 80% of Black kids were achieving passing grades, 80%. And they also discovered that 93% of white students were achieving a passing grade. And so they step back and say, how can we improve? Which is a good thing to do. But instead of asking the question, well, what is it that's contributing to success? Is it that those 80% of Black kids are studying more? Is it that the 93% of white kids are taking advantage of teacher tutoring hours? Are they doing more homework? The leadership said, no, we're gonna study the failure component. So if 80% of Black kids were passing, that means 20% were receiving either a D or an F grade. And that meant 7% of white students were receiving either a D or an F grade. And that 13 percentage point disparity, that's what we got to focus on. That must be due to systemic racism. And so therefore, we're going to become an anti-racist school district. And among the first steps that they made, on some assumption that Black kids can't get their homework in on time. So in the name of anti-racism, they said, we're now going to eliminate that requirement for everybody, for all 106,000 students within the San Diego school system. It's one of these things. Wait, what? And so you see, like, it's a very tangible example of somehow this desire to achieve an equity of failure actually results from ignoring the ingredients of success. As an educator, when you run schools, it's really important to ensure that you're checking if kids are understanding along the way, that you're not just waiting until the end of the year to see if mastery has been achieved. And also, study habits are really important. So when you start to send the signal that you don't have to hand in homework on time, it's literally forging the low expectations. It's telling you that, well, we all have to come down to the standard, that because these Black kids, they can't get their homework done on time.
Yeah, that low expectation thing and bringing the standards down. I mean, recently, like it's in the last year, I read this book, Acting White, and it wasn't the book by Buck. It was it was a critical race theory book or anti-whiteness book type of thing. And the prologue of the book was about how Obama talked, dressed, and acted white. And the rest of the book was about how you shouldn't act white. Now, the first thing when I read that was, all I could think of was, you're calling people uppity now. I mean, that's all it is.
Right.
But it comes from a PhD, so it's okay, I guess. Like, you're taking away the tools that all children need. If you were worried, like, I don't understand, like, if you're worried about, Black and brown kids who aren't doing as well, what does not focusing on the fundamentals, like reading, writing, and arithmetic, like, when you move away from that, how do you expect them to succeed? And I'll just go on a little bit from this. It's in South Africa in 2016, they had a conference at the University of Johannesburg that said science must fall. It was basically the philosophy department. Science must fall. So it was the philosophy department talking with the science department. And then for 2 years after that, they had more conferences on the same subject, and they changed that to decolonize science.
Oh.
Now this year, or it was late last year, early this year, I read an article coming out from South Africa saying, we are going to decolonize physics. We are looking for a Black physics for South Africa. I mean, that's the worst possible thing you can do. Like, there is no Black physics. There is no, this urge to say, okay, well, this science, reason, objectivity, that belongs to white people. That's what racists used to say.
That's what racists do say.
Yeah, no, but that's what I mean. Like, that's how you kept Black and brown people out of science. And now to make achievements in science, you want to do this? Like, I don't understand the logic of that. And
well, and by the way, there's a vaccine for the COVID pandemic that's now being spread across the world, thankfully. Do we care about the racial background of all the scientists and biologists and all the incredible people that, should we, before we take this, are we now going to assess the racial makeup of the people who contributed?
Some people were. When Oxford was announcing their vaccine efforts, someone in the UK put out, I hope Oxford doesn't make the vaccine first, because that would be more imperialism.
You know what? I wonder if the person who wrote that has gotten a vaccine. Let's just put it this way. Creating race-based interpretations like that does disservice to everyone. It makes us see the world through a racial prism where we ascribe characteristics of whiteness, being on time, being conscientious, working hard, being diligent. Somehow we ascribe things like that to whiteness or intelligence, and so therefore, like, what is that? What is the implication for being Black or someone who's not white? It's like the simplistic, racist view of the world.
100%. I wanted to, because your new project you're talking about, starting those schools, and then you'd mentioned that you had been doing, you'd worked in charter schools for a decade. I recently read Thomas Sowell's book, Charter Schools and Their Enemies. Now, I haven't, I wasn't really following a lot of this stuff. I've been following some of the stuff about education, just looking at the curriculums that are coming out. One of the things that struck me when I was reading his book was, I think it was in New York City, there was in the same building a charter school and a public school.
Yep. Another district school. Just charter schools are public schools. So
Okay, sorry. Yeah. So charter school, I get these things a little mixed up.
no. Believe me, you're not the only one. It's important just to clarify.
But they were in the same building.
Yep.
And the charter school students were, getting some of the top marks in the country, and the other school weren't. They were like near the bottom. Now, if that doesn't give you, when people see data like that, like, why don't they at least want to bring the other public schools up to the same kind of standards? And I know, okay, like I know charter schools aren't a silver bullet, because you can have charter schools that are trying something completely experimental that's not going to work.
You can have charter schools that are experimental. I mean, the whole idea of charter schools emerged 2 decades ago because parents were seeking innovations and they were seeking compelling alternatives to the schools in their neighborhood that unfortunately were providing a terrible education for their kids. And by the way, when I ran charter schools, we were in that situation where we were co-located with traditional district schools. So we were recruiting kids from the same neighborhood, same building, actually receiving less money per pupil because of union opposition. Charter schools actually receive less money. So with all of those conditions, our schools far outperformed the district schools, and we tried to very much be partners. Tried to offer shared training, shared techniques, shared the way that we did our schedules, reading instruction. Tried to, because we were all part of one community. I care. I care for the kids that were enrolled in our schools in our building, but I also care about the kids who were in the district school because I saw what was happening. And so your question, when you see such huge educational gaps in favor of the charter schools, normally, why wouldn't we want to study that and be positive? And unfortunately, it's a much longer story, but there are people who benefit from preserving the status quo. And, it's why I'm now launching a new network of international baccalaureate high schools in the South Bronx to demonstrate that we don't have to have the failure rate that we do. In District 7 in the South Bronx in 2015, for all the kids that started in 2015, 4 years later in 2019, only 2% graduated from high school ready for college. That means they started in 2015 and some kids dropped out altogether and never made it to their senior year, or they did graduate, but a significant portion of them couldn't even read the diploma that had just been conferred upon them. So that's outrageous, and it doesn't have to be that way. And so what charter schools provide is the ability for innovative leadership to put forth a set of ideas on the kind of school that they'd like to lead. And then if they don't work, they're shut down, And so this to me is one of the most fundamental solutions when you do look at, for example, racial gaps in educational outcomes. No one's denying that these gaps exist. The question is, what's causing it and what's the solution? And if we start to realize that there's it's not monocausal, meaning that if you look at these racial gaps, there's only one answer, and it's systemic racism, and that it could actually be that there's not enough choice of high quality schools. Let's think about that. You start to develop a whole new set of interventions to address these issues.
Yeah, like when you mentioned that, like I've spoken to a few people about this specific thing that you meant, like just focusing on systemic racism, or focusing on whiteness or whatever. If I look at it, my read of it, it started around 97 where they made that shift. Like the mid to late 90s is where they made that shift from it's looking at it looking at it objectively and trying to figure out what's going on to saying, oh, it must be racism. And I'm not saying that that became global at that point, but I think that's when the little shift happened. I mean, that's doing a detriment to yourselves. I mean, I don't want to say that there is, no racism or anything like that. And I'm sure it plays some factor, but if it, even if you had the best school in the world in a, you know, crime-ridden poor neighborhood, that's not going to serve those kids. So, I mean, yes, the schools are important, education's important, but you know, you might have to spend money to, boost business in the neighborhood. You might need to help reduce crime. There's a lot of different factors, but to say all of that is a cause of racism, I mean, again, you're doing yourself a disservice and you're doing those communities a disservice because you're not looking for what the actual problem might be.
Well, I've been in this work for a long time, and gaps exist in the world. Doing this work for a long time, you recognize that gaps do exist, and gaps exist by race, by gender, but by a whole bunch of other factors too, the number of hours spent studying. And so for me, if you're really genuinely interested in finding solutions, you have to be able to confront the real data and be honest about both factors that might be related to policy or structural, as well as individual behaviors that are within the control of our students, certainly as they enter young adulthood. So, for example, I've done a lot of work on the relationship between family structure and the ultimate success of kids who are being raised in families, right? The stability and structure of a family, married to parent household. The data is overwhelming. It has far greater outcomes for both the parents and the children, as opposed to children who are born to single parents, particularly those 24 and under. You've got 5 or 6 times the likelihood of poverty, which then brings on a whole host of other issues. And so if we know that, then it's incumbent upon us to teach young people about the passage into young adulthood, the series of life decisions that give them a much greater shot at success. That is something that's within the individual control of 7-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old to control whether or not the country decides that reparations is the answer, right? We have to, ensure young people understand their sense of agency, the power to influence what's in front of them, things like doing well in school, because, all these issues start early. And so when we're concerned about why don't we have representation in STEM careers and other things like that, sure, but why would you expect us to have equal outcomes when, for example, only 2% of kids in the Bronx are graduating from high school ready for college, right? So we have to think about schooling and the early environments for kids if we really want to address these issues fundamentally.
Yeah, no. I mean, I've said that a couple of times too. Like, if you focus on the college, like, what Harvard does, and then they increase the SAT scores for, Black kids, they reduce them for Asians and white kids. You're not doing a service to anyone. You're not.
Well, you're right. You're cementing. If you do that, like, yeah, in order for you to get in, we're gonna reduce the cut score, reduce the threshold. What other impression can you have than you must be inferior? What other takeaway is there? It's saying you cannot compete at the same level.
There could be people who come in and do well, even though they don't meet the standards that Harvard set. But Harvard's a tough place. It's considered one of the best schools. I'm assuming the competition is really hard. If the kids aren't prepared when they're coming in, they're not going to do well and they're going to fail. And I mean, that might be part of it, saying, okay, I'm not good enough. But my one question was, if you have someone that you think, okay, you know what, you've shown potential, you've done really well in high school, you've improved, but we need to give you this bump so you can make the cut. Instead of like doing that, why not say, we'll reserve a place for you the following year. In this year, go to a community college, go somewhere, take these prep courses, and maintain whatever a B average. They give them some goal like that. And if they can show that they can do that, they're, at least they go into Harvard or wherever, or Yale, or Caltech, or wherever they're going, and they've got preparation to succeed. Like, I don't understand why that isn't an option somehow.
I mean, sure. I mean, I would, if that option were to exist, though, I would not make it exclusively for Black kids. I'd make it available to any kid.
Oh yeah, no, it
that
should be.
might benefit from an additional year of learning. I mean, in the design of the high school that we're crafting right now, because the International Baccalaureate program is very rigorous, it may be that we have what's called a Prep 10 year, which is so after your first year of ninth grade, we assess you and say, could you benefit from an additional year of learning? So as opposed to going directly into 10th grade, there'd be what's called a Prep 10 year. So you might have grades 9, Prep 10, and 10 before you enter the last 2 years, which is the really high focus of the International Baccalaureate Diploma and Careers Program. But we're not going to say that Prep 10 is only available to, the Hispanic kids, because you might, it should be based on where the developmental stages of the student, and if that's will work for them, great. I mean, I went to Cornell University undergraduate in the College of Engineering, and I was one of the few Black male students there. But unfortunately, I saw a number of my colleagues fail out. They were rushing fraternities and doing these other things. So there might be other reasons, but I saw it, like really talented guys in particular didn't make it and to the graduation. And that, you have to wonder, was it that they were set up to fail?
Yeah.
And for me, again, that's why I run schools, because I want to ensure that when you see a Black student at a top university, you're not wondering, are you there just because, they lowered the standard for you to get in? Because that's insidious.
Oh, that's awful. And that's one of the reasons I hate that low expectations things. I don't want a job because I'm brown. I don't want a promotion because I'm brown. I want it on my merit. I understand a pure meritocracy has some issues, but you should have people striving for getting accepted for their performance, not for.
Yeah. And look, certainly pure merit would be great, but we also have to understand human behavior, and it's not as if there's no opportunity to learn from lived history. People get jobs for merit. People get jobs because they're part of networks. People get jobs for a whole host of reasons. And so we have to ensure our kids understand that. It's not racism per se. It's how does the world work? If you want to make money, do you study a field that, if you look at the data, there's high unemployment rates, or do you want to go into fields like finance or engineering where graduates make a lot more money? Like, okay, I'll do that. Like, or if you want to meet leadership within a particular industry, well, there are student groups, there are other ways to become part of that community. And so that's merit too. The harder you work, the more you achieve. Absolutely. And we as adults need to educate our kids about how the world works, not because of some oppressive racial structure, but humanity has, been around a long time. And if we know that there's certain behaviors that are a lot more likely to put you in the proximity of success, let's teach that to our kids. So it is about merit. And of course, we'd all love a pure system based on merit, but nothing is that pure. And you have to understand the mechanics of how people are successful.
Oh, yeah. No, I get that. That's a good point. Something you mentioned earlier, and it was like you used to have waiting lists for your charter schools, and parents were trying to get in. Your recent episode about I think it's Pineywood School.
Yeah.
I forget the name of your guest, but he talked about going to 7 different schools, I think between like kindergarten and grade 7 or something like that.
Yeah, in his own life,
yeah,
right?
Okay, so My family moved here in 75. I started going to school in December 75. I started going to school in 76. Between kindergarten and grade 6, I went to 8 different schools.
Wow.
A couple of times because I moved, my parents moved, but mainly because my parents were like, "Oh, we heard this school is really good, so we're going to put you in there." And then, "Oh no, we heard this school is doing better." So they were looking for the best
Right.
possible school they could send me to.
Right.
Was
And it sounds like they had the power of choice.
Yeah, it was all, they were all public schools, and in that time in Quebec, it was weird because they were about to pass a law about the French language, and we came in just below it. If we come in after that, I would have been forced to go to French schools. But we came in before it. My parents had the choice to send me to English or French schools. And then there was also a divide between Catholic and Protestant school boards at the time in Quebec. So yeah, but they did have that. I mean, there were private schools that you could go to and whatever. My parents couldn't afford it, obviously. But yeah, but they chose it. But that's difficult for a kid as well. But things like that kind of go, or waiting lists at your charter schools. I mean, that should go to show that the parents are looking for a better option. And I'm just gonna add one other thing. Like, I'm not a big fan of Derek Bell, but one thing that he wrote that kind of stuck with me that I think was really important, but he took it too far, was when he was talking about desegregating schools, and he said they should segregated education, not the schools. And that actually is a good point. I mean, Bell goes a little bit further past that.
What do you mean by that?
Okay, instead of busing kids an hour to go to a better school, why not fix the school in their neighborhood?
Of course.
Yeah, that should have been a no-brainer, or the busing should have been a stopgap at for a few years while you fix that.
Well, there's something very insidious about the very idea of busing, right? That we've got to, in order for a Black kid to get good education, we've got to bus them out of their predominantly Black community into a white neighborhood, white school, because that's where the good education is. It's actually one of the most, in my view, actually racist practices that we just sort of accept. And many people aren't familiar with something called the Rosenwald Schools, which were the idea of Booker T. Washington in the early 1900s, where during segregation, he had the idea that, okay, fine, we don't need white, okay, if our schools are going to be segregated, fine, we're going to create great schools. And so he convinced Julius Rosenwald, who at the time led the Sears Company, which was the largest retailer, like imagine Walmart today, financing more than 5,000 schools in the South that exclusively taught Black children, with Black educators, high expectations, high standards. And they said, fine, we'll be in segregated schools, because segregation doesn't mean for us inferior. And the irony is that the Brown versus Board of Education decision that said, that separate is unequal and separate is inherently inferior, made the Rosenwald schools unconstitutional and illegal. They had to disband. So you just think about that. So this perception that you must have racial integration in order for Black kids to be successful is just ridiculous. I mean, I run schools in the heart of the South Bronx. It's not as if we're going to wait for suddenly a wave of middle-class white people to show up.
Yeah, no, but
I was like, oh, thank the Lord, we're going to run great schools and we're going to have high expectations. And so there is this underlying insidious assumption, and we just got to fight against it.
Let's just say you had schools in Black neighborhoods, or those Rosenwald schools. Instead of debanding them, I said, okay, you know what? We'll open them up to everyone.
Exactly.
If they were in the Deep South, I'm sure there were poor white neighborhoods where the schools were atrocious that might have benefited from those Rosenwald schools. So if
you know what, it's probably true. It's probably true. But because they may have assumed, well, I'm poor white, I can't go to that Black school because somehow it's inferior. Who knows? I mean, all this stuff cuts all ways, right?
Okay, take when they did the desegregation, if the school wasn't up to speed, okay, you need a stopgap measure. So we're going to bus for 2 years until we fix this school or something. I can understand that. But again, at that point, if it's a school in, a predominantly black neighborhood and it's next to a, low income white neighborhood as well, like it's an urban, like, like you're talking about the Bronx, or if you're in like, other, in like South Central Chicago or something like that, if you're like in places like that and there's poor neighborhoods, one's predominantly black, one's predominantly white, you fix a school in the black neighborhood. I mean, if I was a white family in the other neighborhood and I'm close enough to that, I'd want to send my kids there. Like,
by the way, in the South Bronx, the network I used to lead, we converted this dilapidated 2-story, 55,000 square foot building that had been empty for 4 years, and we transformed it into this 5-story, 85,000 square foot building. It's all boys school. It's an amazing school, not just the building, but what's happening inside in terms of the education. And now guess what's starting to happen? Like people see that and they're like, oh wow, maybe I'll move to that neighborhood, or maybe I'll try to get my kid into that school. So yeah, quality is the thing. Build great schools. Have high expectations. If you want to deal with race-related issues, that is a much better place to start, in addition to focusing on having intact families, so that our kids, when they go to the great school, can also go home to a stable environment. And I think we focus on those kinds of things, we'll see a lot better results across race.
From the administrators and the teachers, people like yourselves, okay, pride that people like our schools and they want to come here. But from the students themselves, I mean, we're setting an example for other people. People are looking up to us. I mean, that, like, you get pride from, or maybe I shouldn't say I got pride from when I did well. I was an awful student. I got good marks. I could sponge everything up. But there's some people who were ashamed because they got good grades, and I don't want to seem like I don't want to seem like a bookworm, or I don't want to seem like a nerd or whatever. You should be able to take pride in your accomplishments, and you should be able to show that. You'd mentioned, like I said this at the start about you did that little conference on history, but you mentioned a couple of things that, like people not really knowing about some of this stuff. Okay, you were working on the 1776 Unites project.
Yeah.
Now the 1776 Commission got taken off the White House website. Now,
completely disconnected.
Yeah,
1776.
I know that. I know you're completely disconnected. But when Trump came out with that, were you like, oh no, they're going to take something away from our project?
No, we did have concern that just simply because of the fact that 1776 was in the title, for both, that people would assume that what we were launching, and for your viewers who aren't familiar with it, about a year ago, a group of Black-led scholars led by Bob Woodson, who's an amazing leader who's been helping low-income communities for 40 years, develop pathways to move from persecution to prosperity by embracing the principles of family and faith and hard work and entrepreneurship and a commitment to education. He had the idea, in response to the New York Times 1619 project, that a group of Black-led scholars called 1776 Unites should launch a movement to show that there is not monolithic thought within the Black community, and that there's a strong segment of the Black community that believes, that has encountered racism, has encountered discrimination, and yet we understand the history of our people in the United States, the story of resiliency, the story of determination, the story of actually embracing the founding ideals of the country, to be successful. And it's been quite powerful, because there's such a dominant narrative that if you're Black, you're just supposed to be a victim and oppressed and terrified to walk on the street because the police are just going to come up and shoot you. And we just have a very different view of what can be possible for our children with high expectations, and if they do understand the true founding ideals of our country.
I mean, there's a true founding ideals. I looked into this a little bit. I could be wrong here, but I think there's only 2 states that require civics classes, like for graduation. And
yeah.
I mean, that's like, I think you need to bring civics back. There was an article today, I read it this morning, because of the high number of young people that voted, you don't need civics classes anymore. It's like, well, A, you don't really have them.
Oh, and they weren't voting because they had a strong understanding of civics. They were voting because they've been whipped up in a frenzy and on one political aisle or the other.
Yeah.
And it's I mean, it's actually a very serious thing. I mean, the nation's report card, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, every couple of years measures things like reading and math, and it also measures what is the understanding of history and civics in our country. And the last assessment that came out said that only 15%, 15% of all 12th graders in our country have even a basic understanding of American history or our civic institutions, how they work. And so is it really that surprising when you have such a low percent of our populace that understands our country's framework, that the president of the United States can say to his supporters, we can overturn this election. I mean, the vice president can just ignore the will of the people, right? You're like, oh, well, maybe that's why people are so easily accepting of this idea. And by the way, on the other side, the 1619 Project, is it so surprising that when people have such a low understanding or low grasp of the true full story of the African American experience in the United States, that can gain traction as well? So on both sides, the lack of high quality civic education and an understanding of American and world history is paying real consequences for us as a nation.
Okay, and I 100% agree with you there. Like I focus a bit, or I should say I focus quite a bit on like the critical race theory based education stuff, but you have to talk about things in the South as well. Like I know Texas and Mississippi for sure. I think Tennessee as well. And I'd have to look at some of the other states, but where, they downplay Jim Crow when they teach history, where they don't really talk about slavery or, the slaves didn't have it that bad. Like that's completely awful as well. Like you don't want that.
Right. No, I agree. In fact, this is a legitimate beef that a lot of folks who look at how history is taught in our country. It's one of the reasons I really advocate for studying history using primary documents, not looking at textbooks, which are always all written through whatever the ideology is of the authors, who are trying to put history in a popular context, in an ideology that fits with whatever the author is, as opposed to going back in time, reading the documents from 1772 and reading the Federalist Papers and actually transporting yourself in a place where the future was not known. It's really easy for all of us to sort of look back and say, weren't those people evil? Weren't they terrible? Look at the things that they did. And recognize that the culture at that time or the context at that time forced you to grapple with issues. And a lot of the primary documents bring that out. And I think the more that young people understand that, we live in the present, and when you look at history, you have to take into account context and chronology, and all of that's missing. And so I, for one, again, that's why I'm running schools, because I feel, for me, it's my vehicle through which to ensure the next generation doesn't replicate some of the things that we're seeing today.
Do you think in schools, so okay, you have English class, then you have math class, then you have geography, then you have history. Now, something like English, okay, you learn to read and write, you learned how to make sentence structure, but I mean, when I was a kid and I was going to school, some of our markings on history tests and geography tests and things like that were our, spelling mistakes, and that played a small role in it. But, can't you then at the same time use your history class to not necessarily to teach English, instill a love of reading, instill a love of writing, if not even a love, like, acceptance of it. And so it's not like it's a huge chore. I mean, it's instead of like all these specialized courses, this is history, we're only going to learn history, and, you need to learn these dates and this, and that. I don't know if that's a possible way of doing things. I don't know if that was how it works, or
Well, Obaid, you've just uncovered probably one of the biggest ideological battles over the last 30 years in terms of teaching reading. For a lot of philosophy of reading instruction, some people believe that first you learn to read and then you read to learn as a sequential process. And the implication of that philosophy of learn to read, read to learn, is that in the early grades, from pre-K through probably third grade, content isn't really the important thing. So you're reading disconnected content because all you're really interested is building skills, the learn to read. So if you read a passage, what's the main idea that the author is trying to get across, or what's the genre? So content is agnostic. And then you do read to learn, which is that you're now reading about the Brooklyn Bridge, or you're reading about American history, or you're building your core body of knowledge. That ideology has been soundly rejected by some, or by many, especially E.D. Hirsch, if you're ever familiar with something called cultural literacy. His philosophy was it shouldn't be a sequential process. It actually should be parallel, so that when you're learning to read, what you're reading is actually consequential. It's not just some random stuff. So you're actually, while you're learning about how to interpret the main idea, you're learning about the foundational elements of civil society. You're learning about our government. You're learning about history. And so it's what's called a content-rich approach to reading instruction, where in the early years, you have a much more substantive content delivered to kids, and it's still argued today, and partly because now we're in much more of a testing environment, and so when states say they're going to test and they don't say they're going to have tests that are focused on content, which substantive content, then that leads educators to say, okay, great, then we don't have to teach that. And so that's part of the reason you've seen the reductions in social studies being taught. We've gone from 5 days a week to, in some schools, 1 day, 45 minutes. So there are reasons why American history, civics are disappearing from schedules, particularly in the elementary schools.
Okay, sticking with the history thing, getting rid of it, to me, just blows my mind. I mean, it was one of my favorite subjects anyways in school, so maybe that's why I'm a little biased.
Well, yeah, that's the other thing. I mean, when you have rich content, it's a reason to engage kids.
Yeah. But okay, sticking with the history thing, okay, Black History Month. I know a few people have talked about this, but is it maybe past the point of saying, okay, you know what, we don't need Black History Month. Black history is part of American history, and when we're going to talk about 1776, we'll talk about the Black Americans at that time who contributed. When you talk about, you put the people in the context of the times that you're discussing. So you don't have Black History Month where you have the greatest hits. You have history taught throughout the year.
Right.
And, when you're talking about civil rights, you talk about the people of that era. When you're talking about, Brown versus the Board of Education, when you go back to the 30s and 40s, I mean, you put the people specific to the times you're discussing. Wouldn't that make it a better way of teaching it? Wouldn't that show it as...
I 100% agree. Again, good intentions. I'm sure the people who originally conceived the idea of a Black History Month had great intentions, which was to say, let's create a specific time to ensure that Black history is taught. It came from this place of it's not being taught, so let's create a special moment for it to happen. I think now the compartmentalization isn't helpful. I mean, in the whole scheme of things, that I wouldn't. In the whole scheme of things, in terms of how do I improve economic and academic and life outcomes for Black kids, I wouldn't focus on, getting rid of Black History Month, just because I think that's just another symbolic waste of time that people just invent reasons to get agitated over, when 91% of Black women 24 and under in 2018 who gave birth outside of marriage, right? Like they're much more substantive issues that we need to focus on versus these distractions, which have absolutely no impact on whether or not kids succeed or not. So I mean, I'm not a big fan of Black History Month, but the truth is, I think it's so incidental to the real factors that drive whether or not kids are successful or not, that, I give it a pass.
Okay, I'm not saying that getting rid of Black History Month and then like doing like a history where you teach it is going to fix anything. But yeah, I mean, and I get what your point is. Oh my God, there's, they got rid of Black History Month. He must be a racist. Not focusing on the fact that, okay, they've actually put in more Black history into the curriculum now. I'm just, that those are little, it seems incidental or whatever, but I think that's where we're at. Like, you mentioned Trump with the, the stealing the vote, and I'm not defending Trump in any way here. Like that whole thing was insane. What happened on the 6th was insane. I'm just going to give you like just one counter to that. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Everything's horrible. You have to wear a mask. Don't go stand in groups. It's dangerous for you to stand in line to vote, and for long periods of time. Blah 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 blah. It's safer to vote in by mail, which there's some logic there. But the same people who tell you that then say, well, racism is a worse virus than COVID, and saying basically giving tacit approval to Black Lives Matter protests.
Right.
When someone sees that, okay, so the virus won't affect me if I go to Black Lives Matter, but it'll affect me if I stand in line to vote.
I don't know, people see hypocrisy in that, for sure.
And it's just, again, like this has nothing. Some of it has to do with education. It's like, okay, you can't see the logical fallacies in here. Or you're not willing to like call it out. Like, I mean,
no, that's what's tough in our society right now. I mean, we had a summer of riots and protests and violence, but for many, they look at January 6th as the only example of crazy violence that needs to be punished. I mean, they're not necessarily morally equivalent, but it's all bad. I mean, there are many Black people that lost their livelihoods this summer. There are many Black kids that were shot, partly because the police pulled back. And, in almost every major city in the United States last year had skyrocketing rates of death, of violence, of homicide, particularly for Black people. And so why did that happen? Let's talk about that. Let's have an honest conversation about what the consequences are of how we choose to sometimes focus on events and choose to ignore others.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't trying to put an equivalency. I was just saying when you're looking at, when you get those two narratives, they're telling us to vote in by mail because they're trying to steal the election, and then vote in by mail because it's too dangerous. But then you can go to this 1,000-person protest. That's fine.
No, I mean, there were actually public health officials who said that the virus of racism was worse than the virus of COVID. So therefore, go forth. Go forth and protest.
And then again, if you don't have a population that's taught critical thinking, not critical theory, and you don't have a population that can evaluate things. And again, this comes down to education in a huge way. When you see things like that, okay, you might still say, what, I'm going to vote by mail because it is still dangerous, but you're able to call out the hypocrisy.
Yeah.
And
and I very much try to see the best in people in that. I think a lot of people who were protesting, they saw the George Floyd tape. They saw, what they thought happened with Jacob Blake in Wisconsin. Now it turns out he admits he was carrying a knife and he was dangerous. A lot of these things turn out to be very different when all the facts come out. But they genuinely want to. They see injustice in outcomes, and there is injustice in outcomes. But the solutions that they're being fed by, Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, that all these outcomes must be due to racism, and therefore every solution, it's these evil white people, and so therefore white people need to, declare their privilege and do all these things, right? And all of it is this insidious Black inferiority, the implication of it, right? And so what we at 1776 Unite said was, let's create a compelling alternative. Let's in the voice of Black people. Like, if everyone's telling me I'm so oppressed, well, actually, here's strategies for how you can live your life in this country and not be oppressed, while actually acknowledging discrimination and the role of racism, right? And so I think dialogue and compelling alternatives is an important part of how we move forward together as a people. Cancel culture and all these things is seeking to shut down conversation. For me, I'd love to debate other Black leaders of, is reparations the right answer for our people? Is racial equity, in every single outcome? I want my kids to beat your kids. I don't want my kid to be equal in every aspect. I mean, what does that even mean? It's like nonsensical.
The reparations thing, and I mean, I've heard a lot of different things. You can talk about the Ta-Nehisi Coates version of it. But I mean, I think there is something to, if you take a look at some of the legacy. So, GIs coming back, soldiers coming back from World War II, and I think Korea, who didn't get access to the GI Bill. Black soldiers coming back, and that does affect the earning potential of those people, and then trickles down.
Yep.
Redlining, not being able to buy a home, not being able to afford a home.
Yep.
Again, that affects how much wealth you have. And I was speaking to Will Riley about
which is illegal, right? Redlining has been illegal since what, late 60s, early 70s?
I'm not saying it's still around, but I'm just saying, okay, it might have a little bit less effect now than it did right away, but immediately that had an effect. So I can see what's saying, okay, you know what? Instead of giving people individually money, which I think would be really almost impossible to do.
Well, that's what most of the advocates are pushing for. Yeah. They're pushing for $13 to $14 trillion massive redistribution program, where you have to prove that you're a descendant of slave. I think you have to identify it as a Black person for at least 10 years, and that the average amount would be, I think, like $250,000 per American Black descendant of slaves. And the government just starts showering money on people, no strings attached, of course, and then there's no end to that.
But I mean,
there might be another round after that, and as Nicole Hannah-Jones said on a radio show, if people want to send that money at a Gucci store, that's up to them. So I'm like, okay, so let's have that debate.
Yeah, but I mean,
let's actually have that conversation.
I mean, this is again, I'm not a policy expert. I'm not an expert in just about anything. But wouldn't it be better served to say, okay, you know what? Yes, things need to be done, but we're going to invest and really invest in communities, not just, put up a playground and say, here, we invested, actually take, I'm not saying it's all going to be all 13 trillion or whatever that number that was, but, we'll invest in small businesses. We'll fix up housing.
Now you're on my turf, right? What are the ways that we build wealth within our community? What are the ways that Black people have built wealth? What are the ways that people of every background have built wealth? Entrepreneurship, home ownership, pooling resources together, education. We haven't talked a lot about faith, but the role of strong religious values has played a role in almost every important story of groups of people that have moved from persecution to prosperity. Let's have conversations. Is it that the government should just start showering checks for $200,000 to some component of the Black community that says that they were, that prove that they were descendants of slave? Is that what's really going to get us where we want to go? Or is that going to create a massive, even further racial divide in our country, not deal with the issues of skyrocketing out of wedlock birth rates, the lack of high quality schools in low income communities that serve both Black and white? You go to Appalachia, it's not like the schools are great there either, right? So it's this idea that somehow cash replaces the function of a dad who's there for, and a husband who's there for their child, or that cash replaces having access to a local neighborhood high quality school. But let's have that debate. I mean, the thing that frustrates me is that all these people just seem to be running scared. Kendi doesn't want to debate. Nicole Hannah-Jones doesn't want to meet with Glenn Loury. You know, I'm trying to set up a debate series with Black scholars who are on the side of reparations. You know, no response. You know, so that's what's frustrating to me. Like, if these ideas are so good, don't just say it to white people. Let's have a conversation amongst Black people about how we as a society should move forward, because that's what used to exist. W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington. I mean, these were aspects of our community of self-determination. And my hope is that 2021 is a year that Black people actually can come together and talk about, like, if Black lives matter to us, then let's figure out the best way forward, as opposed to other people dictating what the path should be.
Like, I think what you're also doing with your podcast, you're bringing out, like, Black voices you might not hear, and you're talking about this, there's a huge huge viewpoint diversity within the Black community. You're not all Ta-Nehisi Coates or Ibram Kendi, but I noticed this with Islam.
Nor are all white supremacists by virtue of being white, right?
Yeah, exactly. But one thing I noticed was, okay, so I come from a Muslim background. I've been an ex-Muslim for 30 some odd years now. But I noticed it in starting after 9/11. Any ex-Muslim or reform Muslim or moderate Muslim that spoke out against the excesses of Islam, oh, you're a white supremacist. I mean, Majid Nawaz got called a house Muslim, which is like one of the worst things I heard about that. And you call them coconuts and Uncle Toms and native informants. In the last
informants.
I don't know if that means I inform on natives or if I'm a native that inform. I don't know. I have no clue. But whatever. It's just these horrible things. But
well, the latest thing, by the way, I think is was it multiracial whiteness?
Oh God, I saw that. But I mean, but things like that, like I've seen that directed towards not even. I don't want to say conservative Blacks, because John McWhorter is not a conservative, but like horrible racial slurs coming from other Black people or quote unquote progressive whites. And
I mean, there it is. I mean, that if you don't conform to the ideology, then you must not really be Black. But, if you're not down with the program to say that the government's got to give us reparations, or just accept this mantra that if you're Black, you're just going to get shot by the police, and then you actually go look at the data and like, wait a minute, like less than 10 Black people got shot by the police, and there are way more Black people being shot by other Black people. Why don't we talk about that? Because if you talk about that, that takes the attention away from what at least folks like Kendi and D'Angelo and Coates believe is the real issue, which is the white supremacy. And and they can't tolerate and this is why McWhorter says it's a religion. You have to be excommunicated, because they cannot tolerate any kind of conflict with the ideology.
Yeah, I know. I see the religious. When I came back in 2014 to North America and I saw all this stuff, first thing that popped in my head is like, we're getting secular blasphemy laws. Like, when did this happen? I mean, there are so many parallels to religion. I mean, especially like the whole whiteness thing. Like when you read into Calvinism and about total depravity, like the whole idea of whiteness just sounds like total depravity. You've just really replaced sin with whiteness. It's awful. Look, I don't want to keep you too long. Thank you very much for your time. If you got any last minute words to give to people about education, what they should focus on, anything like that?
Well, I'm writing a book called Agency, and the reason I'm writing it, and it's designed for young people, and young people of all races. It's really important for young people to have a sense of agency, right? This idea that they do have the ability to be a master of their own destiny, that they do have control in their life. But part of that is that young people have to understand that they live in a good, if not great, country that's not hostile to their dreams, that they have a shot, but part of the responsibility is theirs. This doesn't mean that they should pull themselves up by the bootstraps, because that's not it either. There's a role for mediating institutions, for strong schools, and that's why school choice is so important. Strong families, which is why it's so important to speak to young people about the pathways in life that give them the best shot at success. And having children outside of marriage, especially if you're 24 and under, is usually a recipe for poverty and disaster for everyone in the equation. Having a faith commitment, like these things are elements of how you can cocoon yourself in environments with people that love you, that people that want to support you. And yes, there might be these other forces, but those cocoons are pretty strong, and they've been proven pretty strong for millions and millions and millions of people of all races. So that's my message, that I'm very cognizant of how the real world works, and the reason I run schools is I want to prepare young people for that world and all the positive elements that they have the power to control. And so, I'm thank you for having me on, and I'm hopeful that we as a country can have honest conversations like the ones we just had.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. And that was a positive note to end on. After, like, actually my last episode I recorded, I was speaking with Razib Khan, and now it got kind of depressing. But so this was a good change to be ended on something positive. Thanks again for listening. Coming on, sorry, and thanks everyone for listening.